Thank you. We have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask a question first. We've talked a lot, we've referenced a lot of sort of historical high points in the labor movement today when union density was much higher, where it's been higher. And as Mark said, there seems to be, at least in the speakers, agreement that the labor movement needs to be really adopting this broader social justice direction. We know, the Chicago Teachers Union is a good example. But obviously, part of that large union density was often made up with lots of people who were not in that camp and were just looking for something to pay dues and get a sort of social insurance kind of thing. Where do they fall into the direction? Are we looking to, is the idea that with the right education and organizing, they will suddenly become social justice activists too, or is there an acknowledgement that many people who might be in unions might not want to be on the front lines for other justice fights that many of us in this room would want to be in? So how do you, where are those workers, and what role do they play in the future labor movement? That, there's a sort of aura of consensus in this room, but I think there are lots of workers that might be in unions that might necessarily not get on board with that.
Well, I'll start off. I'll just say, the changing demographics of the country necessitates a changing demographics of the labor union movement, and that makes, I think, the broader appeal to social justice an easier sell. That is to say, having more women in the labor movement, more people of color, enhances the chance that the larger social agenda will resonate with those folks. So I think it's possible. Let me just say that I think one appeal to the idea of amending the Civil Rights Act to protect labor organizing is to try to bridge these differences between groups. And Leo, you talked about let's reignite the March on Washington from 1963. And that was the quintessential moment when civil rights groups and labor groups came together. We see it now in places like Canton, Mississippi, where the Nissan plant is being organized by the UAW. And their whole theme with the predominantly black workforce is labor rights as civil rights. And so I think over time, the genuine problem that you've identified, Rachel, will become less salient.
There's two ways to sort of break that down. One way is to sort of confront what I think many people, especially activists by definition, find disappointing, is that oftentimes in the history of the American labor movement, the fight, even at its most militant tactically, even at its most violent tactically, has been a fight for security. I mean, one of the guiding founders in whose shadow we give this conference, this is sad. This is what happens when you get old. You can't remember the founder's name. Sidney Hillman. This is so sad. Anyway, it's been 40 years reading labor history and you can't remember Sidney Hillman's name. Sidney Hillman gave like a famous talk in 1934 directed to the working class of America called like the quest for security or something like that, or the search for security. And there are going to be a lot of workers, a lot of union members who do think of their union dues kind of like paying premiums for insurance. And the only answer about them is just we have to, the activists and the militants have to fight for the rights of those folks to like sit back in their lazy boys, which is what, and watch the Super Bowl. I mean, because not everybody's going to be an activist and a militant. It's just we're going to try, we're going to go 1 to 10. We're going to like try to pump up internal democracy. But there's never been a mass social movement in the history of modernity where everybody was fight the power, all the time, it's like Oscar Wilde didn't say, the problem with socialism is, too many meetings, So So we're going to have to, they say he said it, but he really didn't say it, but it's such a great line. So that's one part. But the other part is what Rick talked about, which is when we talk about struggle today, and like when I was talking about like sort of those 1970s struggles coming out of the 60s, we're not using the default white male. What we have are two categories, like the political philosopher Nancy Fraser talks about, you know, the current of redistribution, and that one's pretty obvious. And then the other thing she talks about is the current of recognition, which I think some people are calling social justice today. Recognition is basically saying, I may be somewhat different than you in some sort of sociological category, but I'm a human being too, and I deserve full equality. And we have those, all those recognitional fights are not going to go away now. It's not 1950. We're going to keep making those fights. At the same time, we make the redistributional fight. Those two things have to be melded, and when you meld them, you get an injury to one is an injury to all. Okay? So so that in that sense, I think we can do a lot. But there are going to be people and they're lazy boys, you know? It's just, most of us are like them sometimes.
I abused my time a little bit earlier, so I'm going to be really brief. I think that I just wanted to say, for me, one of the things that's so critical about the union movement is it actually is a place for challenging racism. And, you know, as a white guy from the South, whose grandfather was probably in the Klan, we think, you know, to be an anti-racist activist, to have the point of view that I have in the world, like that comes not by accident. It comes from the experience I had being part of movements and struggles that I got into from being in the union movement. And I think that you know, you see much more modest versions of this looking at the way white union members vote versus the way the rest of the white population, particularly non-union white population votes. I mean, there are all kinds of indicators that our movement, particularly if we were a little bit more aggressive and audacious, I might say, about tackling some of these bigger questions internally, could be really transformative. And I think we're at a point, as other people have said throughout the day, where we have a chance to do that. I was really loving listening to Jerry Hudson talk about the way that you've got security guards and prison guards and police officers in SEIU having to listen to other SEIU members talk about how does policing happen in our community. Like, I think that's the potential that we have because we actually have created a common space. You know, we're trying to create a common experience for people. It's really powerful. I think we have a lot to learn from the Worker Center movement about being willing to talk about those kind of politics in our organizations and in our internal education. But I think that the moment is sort of here for us to really try and make some big steps. So I'll stop there.
Well, I guess there's a couple questions about the civil rights, but I'm going to do that next. So the first one is, do you think it's important for SEIU and other unions to be reunited with other unions in the AFL-CIO?
Yes.
I mean, sure. I mean, and I say that just because we've tried, right, I mean, we tried transforming the AFL. Like, if you have a mass movement of workers, the organizations take care of themselves, you know? So the organizational sort of changing the chairs around, if you're changing them around, as the old cliche goes, to Titanic, it doesn't really matter that much. You know, then we try change to win. You know, I mean, so fine, yeah, sure, sounds good.
We used to bet sometimes about like how many members could actually, of any of the affiliates of Change to Win, could name the national federation that they were part of. And I still hold out that I could make a lot of money in this crowd if you guys want to take that bet. I think that the point, to put a sharper little moment on it than Rich just did, is whether it was the Sweeney administration or the split in the AFL-CIO in 2005, we're not going to revitalize the labor movement from above. That's the thing that we need to learn from this. You know, I agree with him that if we're actually building the movement from below, the organizations will sort themselves out. So I'm all for unity. I think for most members, however, they don't really see what's the point of any of it. And you know, that speaks to the question of building the movement.
So the next question is for Rick. Well, it's sort of two questions, so I'll just combine them. Could civil rights protections of labor activities be a double-edged sword? For example, could anti-union activists and their backers sue unions under the Civil Rights Act as a union-busting tool during unionization, I can't read this, decertification fights? And also, who are the workers that you envision being protected in this? Is it public sector workers? Is it all workers, including those not currently covered by the NLRA? Or so, just some more details on that.
Yeah. So at the federal level, it would be the covered workers under the NLRA. And then actually, I should clarify that the Ellison-Lewis bill doesn't quite go as far as Moshe and I would. They amend the National Labor Relations Act, but they use the protections of the Civil Rights Act to make that change. My reference to non-covered employees was if we are trying at the state and local level to make change, which, for the foreseeable future, that's where the action will be. It has to be the state and local level. As to the question of whether this would be used by the right, I don't see how it, at least the way we drafted the legislation, how it could be. I think, we already have the concept of civil rights for workers employed by the right wing in the concept of right to work. And so this is meant to recapture that notion on the left. I mean, when Eleanor Roosevelt pushed for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it had in it as a central plank the right to join a union. We weren't then afraid to invoke individual rights on behalf of labor, and then it got distorted by the right wing.
Just as a follow-up, because I saw another one, does individual rights emphasis of the civil rights to join a union require members-only unions to be consistent? I guess to rephrase that, does the model seem to call for a members-only union? Or
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it needs to. Tom Gagin, who is the one who originated this idea of labor organizing as a civil right, has recently come out for members-only unions. And there is a consistent, going back to the last panel, I guess you could say there's a libertarian thread to both of those ideas, but they aren't necessarily connected.
Okay, so somebody sent this question. How should public unions prepare for the end of agency fees?
I'd say do whatever they're doing in Racine, right? I mean, I think you want to engage members. We haven't really invoked Al Shanker much here today. Since I wrote a biography of him, I'll take the liberty of doing so. And towards the end of his life, he was asked about the growing movement towards private school vouchers at the time, and said, well, we'll go out and organize them as well. And I think, I do think the public laws matter a lot and that we should fight for those things. But once you have a loss, that doesn't mean it's the end of the game. And much can be done to energize people and explain to them why being part of the union is important. So I think the efforts in individual places in Wisconsin should be replicated.
I mean, think about admittedly private sector, but think about the culinary union, Culinary 226 in Las Vegas. I mean, that's a right to work state. They have overwhelming compliance to pay union dues because those workers, and anybody who's spent any time around them knows this, those workers are fully mobilized. They have a very strong sense of the power of their union. They have a very strong sense of of their power, their individual power even, within the union, to make their voice heard about collective bargaining. They have a sense of their power within that community, which is the fastest growing city in the United States, or it was until a couple of years ago. So, I mean, when you lose deduction, you know, it cuts both ways, you know? I mean, yeah, it's tough, but there's almost like a reactionary conservative argument that, and the left argument too, that sort of come together and say, look, people self-empower themselves. They pay their dues knowing what they're getting. They take responsibility for doing that. And they consequently feel mobilized and more militant for doing that. Of course, the only problem is you just have to make sure they do it. Because if you lose, if you can't get it together and they don't do it, then your union falls apart. But that's the work.
Two things. One, I think before whatever shakes out with the right for agency fee and the public sector, or fair share in the public sector, before we get to that point, as I said before, I think that one of the key things public sector unions need to really grapple with is how to get out of the sort of habit of being in the shadows and being afraid of the public. I mean, we need to be, the most courageous watchdogs for the public good, and until we are seen as such, I think we're always going to be kind of caught in that vice of like taxpayers worrying about their how are their money being spent, and vulnerable to these arguments about the cost of our pension or our pay packages. I think that for me, I just think a lot about the organizing that we've talked about over and over historically in the 30s and the 40s. This was not done with the level of union staff that we have now. So what is and with far fewer communication tools or means at our disposal to get internally organized. So the hurdles are not insurmountable to American workers. For us, it's really just about actually talking about the need to do it and rethinking institutionally what the role of the staff will be in all of this, because I think that that's sort of in the bloodstream in such a way it doesn't even come out in these conversations sometimes, and that's why I'm pointedly trying to inject it a little bit, because I think that we have not really built a movement that reflects across the board self-activity of working people, and that's where we need to go. So,
real quick, and if anything, public, we talked all day about expanding the message, incorporating the largest possible movement well beyond any given workplace fight, well beyond any given union, and that's for very good structural and historical reasons. That's true. But if anything, that applies double for public sector unions. Because, yeah, the taxpayers are paying the salaries of the union members and the union staff. And now that the taxpayers themselves only have 6.7% union density, they don't kind of get the union thing in the way that they did when, it was at 1/3, which meant that either, in large parts of the country, like even a place like Alabama had 18% density in 1950, which would make it as high as Michigan today. But it meant like at 1/3, it was like you were in a union, somebody in your family was, or somebody down the street was. So public sector unions really have to expand that fight, like we heard about in St. Paul. Oh, you got one already.
Yeah. Jeannie Kemble or Phil Kugler will remember this story better than I do, but there, in New York, when Al Shanker took the union on strike, and he was jailed, but also there was a punishment where the union could no longer have automatic dues checkoff, and there's a story I remember about the grassroots efforts that were put into place, and the checks rolling in. So these obstacles are real, but they can be overcome.
I want to sort of follow up on this, because I'm curious, I totally think the idea of pushing public sector unions to be more transparent sort of guardians of the public is a good idea. How do you envision, taking that into account in the future fights over, wages are stagnant, people are worried they won't have any retirement for themselves, sort of these post-employment healthcare benefits are sort of a very ripe target for political fights coming up. How is the labor movement, can the labor movement be thinking about defending them or talking about them if they should be? Because there's definitely going to be more Scott Walkers who sort of seek to stoke that sort of understandable resentment that I don't even think I'm going to have any health care when I'm, retired and I'm paying for these people's.
See, I've never understood that. That seems like the best argument for private sector unions. If the public sector, which is highly unionized, has decent benefits and the answer isn't let's take it away from them, but rather that should be a powerful argument in favor of unionizing in the private sector, so that you too can enjoy these benefits that were once broadly shared.
I just want to tell a story from Chicago. It's come up a lot, but since we're Shea AFT, let's talk about a really powerful AFT local. The fourth day of the Chicago Teachers Union strike, there was a poll done in the city of Chicago. 55% of the city residents and 66% of public school parents supported the teachers. This is on the fourth day of a strike that has shut down the whole city. Now, how the hell did they do that? Well, it was clear because, to me, what that made clear was that if you ask the people in the city of Chicago, who's fighting for our kids, who's got the interests of our children and our public schools at their heart, is it ROM or is it the teachers union? The people understood it was the teachers union. And I think what they did to get there is actually really more important, because they weren't just talking about the issues and focused on what's the message, how do we frame these things. I mean, certainly they thought a lot about, well, how do we talk to the public about our pensions? How do we talk to the public about things like these credit default swaps? But they didn't see it as a PR problem. They saw it as an activity deficit. They spent 2 years leading into the strike, occupying a Cadillac dealership, saying this Escalade vendor here has gotten $3 million in TIF money from the city of Chicago. That's money that should be, putting a library in my school. They were, doing sit-ins at the Bank of America and grade-ins, in bank lobbies over these exact problems. They essentially took these big questions that Joe McCartan talked about bringing to the bargaining table, and they actually made them things that they were fighting for day in, day out through activity. And I think, in the same way that the Republic Windows sit-down strike really crystallized for some people how, nobody knew what the Warren Act was. And a friend of mine who was organizing home care workers in Chicago said 2 weeks after this, the factory occupation, like these home care workers who were owed back wages were in McDonald's writing, signs about how they deserve their Warren pay, and they were going to go down to their home care agency and picket. I think that's the thing that activity really inspired, and I think that's the stuff that we need to start thinking about, how do we do more of as public sector unions.
Okay, well, I was told to wrap up after that question. Do you want to speak? Okay, so thank you. Great panel.